Everybody, good evening. Welcome to Anderson Ranch and our summer faculty lecture series. I'm Betsy Alwyn. I'm the visiting director of ceramics and expanded media. Before we begin, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Thank you. I'm going to do that too. I want to start by recognizing that Anderson Ranch campus resides on the historic tribal lands of the Ute people who called this area home for over 800 years. In honor of this legacy, we focus on building an inclusive community, maintaining this as a place for inspiration and creativity in the center of the Rocky Mountains. I would also like to remind everyone that tomorrow, right here in Shermer, at 8:45 will be the general orientation. And if you're in the middle of your 2-week workshop, you don't have to come to that. You can just start at 9. Tonight's program will consist of 2 faculty lectures followed by a question and answer period. First, I would like to introduce Kenturah Davis. Kenturah Davis is an artist working between Los Angeles and Accra, Ghana. Using text as a point of departure, she explores the fundamental role that language has in shaping how we understand ourselves and the world around us. Her work has been included in institutional exhibitions in Africa, Asia, Australia, and Europe. Kenturah was commissioned by LA Metro to create large-scale site-specific works permanently installed on the new Crenshaw-LAX rail line. She was an inaugural artist fellow at Next Haven in New Haven, Connecticut. Kenturah is teaching the textile drawing, weaving, and writing workshop this week in painting. Please help me welcome Kenturah Davis to the stage.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you. Hi. Excited to be here. Very much looking forward to meeting as many of you as possible. What I'll be sharing tonight in 20 minutes is an overview of kind of the things that are part of my work, inform my work, are the work, and then some of the new things I'm working on and things that intersect with what I'll be showing here. This you may recognize as ancient Egyptian hieroglyph. And something that's sort of the fundamental to my work is thinking about how language and image making can intersect. And so for a long time, I've been interested in the very beginnings of writing, and hieroglyphs being one of the earliest known writing systems. I love this idea of like image as text. And so thinking through the sort of long history of writing as a kind of technology. I'm really fascinated by the ways we use signs and make marks and assign meaning to those marks to convey information across time and space. So this is another example. In this case, this is a Mesopotamian cuneiform cylinder seal on the right side, and then the sort of impression of that seal on the left. And I think about this a lot because I have a background in printmaking, and usually a sort of like overview of the history of printmaking. A lot of that starts in the East, and I've been thinking about how some of these forms like a cylinder seal is perhaps one of the earliest kinds of printmaking, proto-printmaking. Of course, we can go further back with like the way hand stenciling was done in caves, things like that. But again, this is another kind of thing that I think about in terms of form and mark making and changing a surface to express meaning. And then, of course, this is the Rosetta Stone. And something I realized in sort of researching more about the Rosetta Stone, it was sort of the key for us to decode ancient Egyptian hieroglyph. But I was fascinated with the way that, so the French had taken over part of Egypt when the Rosetta Stone was discovered, and then the British beat them off. So the British got it in their hands, but I was fascinated by the ways that they first began to try and decode the text, and they basically used the stone as a kind of like printmaking matrix. So again, this extension of ideas around printmaking and using a surface to make impressions and other things, or sort of reproduce information. So in my own work, I started painting. I can't even remember when I first started making work. My dad's an artist, so he would always teach us how to draw and paint. So I always had an interest in making work, and so for a long time, I would have called myself a painter. At a certain point, I realized that paint wasn't the medium that was gonna get at the ideas I was most interested in. So I stopped painting, but I always kept a notebook, and then I started writing. And eventually, there was like a sketch where the writing intersected with the sketch, and something clicked, this idea that the quality of a written line is no different than the quality of a drawn line, but with a written line, we've assigned meaning to a series of marks that would otherwise be abstract. And so that began this journey of trying to render portraits entirely by writing. So this is a detail of the first text drawing that I made. And I forgot to say, I've been drawn to making portraits. So that's another thing that I've been working through, is like, what does language have to do with how we see ourselves and other people in the world around us? So this, again, was the first one. Then, I started expanding and developing this way of working. So here's another one. So this is my cursive writing here. And here's a short clip. So it's really, I usually, especially when it's sort of like a longer passage or a phrase, I'll write the phrase out very plainly in the way that you read it. And then I go back in certain areas and just rewrite whatever word is in that space over and over again to build up the sort of tonal quality. So again, it's thinking through this idea of like an image or a portrait that's entirely made with information. And so that really began to like blur the distinction between writing and drawing. So I think of writing as a kind of drawing. So if you can write, you can draw. And so this is that drawing that I was working on. And so it included printmaking processes there. So this is like further along in the process where I started to incorporate other mediums. And so besides my own handwriting, I also started experimenting with using stamp lettering. The grid has been an important part of making the work. So you can see very faintly like the grid, and then you also might be able to make out little letters. So I would grid the paper, assign a letter to each square in the grid so that, again, the text or phrase that I was using to render the image, that it would read the same way we would write it. And then, so in the case of like if there's a W assigned to that square, I would use a W stamp to render that section of the grid. And so this was a 2-panel, these are more details. Ultimately, this is this diptych. And this is when I started sort of pushing the format of the work. So it's a drawing that can be shown in 2 orientations, so you can rotate it, and where the top becomes the bottom, where actually there's no true top or bottom. And then, so in the bio, it mentioned that I spent a lot of time in Accra, Ghana, and living there, I moved there to work with a friend who had a clothing line. And so I got really interested in textile traditions there. And fast forward a couple years when I came back to the States for grad school, I was taking a course on the invention of writing. and I wrote a paper on the hieroglyph for textiles, and then I realized like weaving was invented way before writing, and so in a way weaving is like an earlier material in which one could encode information into it. And so the sort of rich textile tradition of West Africa, there's a lot of forms and signs that convey information. So I was thinking about ways of getting outside of, my kind of privileging writing and writing in English, because that's the only language I know how to write in, and thinking about other ways to introduce ideas around making meaning and conveying meaning to other people. So these are some textiles that either I collected or I would see. And some of these here are using indigo dye. And then this is actually a garment made in Japan, and which brings me to a process that I will be teaching today. I came across this book. I'll go ahead. I came across that book. My paper supplier, most of the drawings I make are on handmade Japanese papers. And my paper supplier had this book, and I had it for years before I really gave much attention to it. Or I looked through it, but I didn't make space to really experiment with the process. But this way of making paper into thread, and it's hard, you can't find a ton of information about it, but it's an old process. I first found this book, then I found a second book that talked a little bit more about the history of it. And so it kind of ruminates on the possible way that this process was invented of making paper into thread, where during the feudal period, some spies needed to get across enemy lines with a secret message. And by that point, paper was invented, so, it was very much available. So people got paper, wrote this message, processed it into thread, wove it into a cloth, and then carried it to its destination, and then that person undid everything to reveal this secret message. And so I was thinking about that it's this, what you would have in that case is this piece of fabric that has these maybe specks of, I don't know, sumi ink or something, that you would, just looking at the material, you would have no idea that there's information kind of embedded in it. And this idea of undoing it, in essence, kind of like destroying the fabric to then reveal the message was just such a beautiful thought. And then it also connected this thing around text and textile, that those two words are related. So I really started to lean in on about thinking about that. So some of the earliest experimentations in making it, with this paper, I wrote black noise over and over again, which is a term for sound that's nearly silent or below our perception. So I like this idea of thinking about by the time it gets processed into thread, it kind of lives up to its definition. This is a video of me writing on paper. And so this paper is also a handmade paper from Japan, and it's made with a really strong fiber. So the process takes getting wet and a lot of manipulation. But I began, writing a phrase. I started doubling the pen just partly to cover more area, but then I also like the idea of even if someone was to undo it, there's still this kind of blurring of the language that demands even more attention to decode it. And so these are pictures of different stages of the process. And this is one of the first finished weavings I made just on my small frame loom. And so you can see there's a pink stripe, so and for that part of the paper, I would have used a red pen. And then the other sort of tonal quality is from the black pen. And then what you see here is more paper that I've written on that will be processed in a thread, and then sort of partway through the process of where these are nearly ready to be twisted into a thread that looks and feels like any other kind of thread that you would weave with in this case. And I was very fortunate. A friend of mine had a loom in storage and loaned it to me, so I upgraded my weaving capabilities, and then we're able to make more sort of tighter, more intricate weavings from there. And so the color there, again, is just evidence of the writing that was used on the paper. And so then I started to think about like how might the drawings live with this weaving process that I was really excited about. So, you know, I showed you drawings that were either made by my handwriting or stamping. I wanted to think about something that would speak to the kind of the way the text disappears through the process of making the paper thread. And so I started scoring text into the paper. And what I loved about that is like, it's a mark that's there but not there. You can only see it because of the light and shadow conditions of the space. And then to render, so I would cover the paper with this text that's scored into it. And then to render the figure, I would do a rubbing on top of it. And I don't know, you've probably done this when you were young, kind of scratched into paper and then do a rubbing on top of that. So that's really what this process is. So that's how the figure is made. And then I treated the frame like a loom. And so in this particular frame, there's like holes along the rail. So the weaving is like, the textile is woven into the frames. So it's like very much integrated together. And here's a detail. And so another thing I started leaning into, I've been thinking a lot about shadows. There's an idea that I really love and think about all the time. Shadows are the architecture of the visual field, meaning that without shadows, you really wouldn't be able to perceive like what's in your environment. And so that kind of shifts it from the way we typically think about shadows as this condition that hides or conceals or is mysterious. As much as that's true, it's also true that shadows reveal. And so this idea that like by scoring into the paper, you can see the text because of the shadow. And then also with the figure, it's the areas where the rendering or the rubbing is the darkest, where the text is the most legible. And so I've been sitting with this idea of like dark illumination, again, kind of flipping the way we normally think about light and shadow. And this is another one where the weaving is incorporated into the frame. And so after a while of doing weaving on my own at home, my subsequent trips to Ghana, I started working with a weaver there to kind of bridge, again, this idea of like encoding information that's cultural, and then combining it with my thread that also has my own writing there. So this is, in this trip, we were experimenting with different weaving patterns. So he's using the paper thread as the weft of the weaving. And he's doing this double warp, for those of you who know weaving language. And so this is one of the first results of that. So the paper thread are all the sort of symbols and kind of blocks of like thicker thread. And here's another one of that. How am I on time? Great. And then here's another example where the weaving collaboration in Ghana is again paired with a drawing where the text is impressed into the paper, and then color and the rubbing of the figure on top of that. And sorry, zooming through details. And I just opened a show in London. Weaving's not in the show, but working through these processes helped make this bridge where I started incorporating vessels into the frame. But the drawings are done similarly, where the text is debossed, impressed into the paper, and then doing the rubbing on top to render the figure. And so another drawing where that can exist in two orientations. And then the newest thing are these cloud drawings, which as soon as I stepped out of the airport, I saw how close the clouds are here. I live in LA. So I've since already probably taken dozens of photos of the clouds. So I'm excited to keep pushing that. But these are some new cloud drawings because I'm interested in the way we can sometimes see shapes in clouds. So in a way they can be sort of figurative, but then abstract, and some ideas around quantum physics and movement, ideas like that are embossed into the paper. So if you happen to be going to London before July 20th, check out my show. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenturah. Our next speaker is Stuart Gair. Stuart Gair received a history degree from Ohio University and completed an MFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Stuart has spent time making work and teaching at the Archie Bray Foundation in Helena, Montana, Harvard University, and Colorado Mountain College in Aspen. Currently, he lives in Athens, Ohio, where he is a professor at Ohio University and makes work at his home studio. Stuart is teaching the thrown and altered forms for soda firing workshop in ceramics. Please help me welcome Stuart to the stage.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. And huge thanks to Anderson Ranch and Betsy Alwyn and Joanne Lee for bringing me in here and coordinating in the months prior and now, and just being so accommodating. I really appreciate it. I've been here for a week. It's been a great week. Looking forward to another great week. We're actually loading the soda kiln tomorrow afternoon, if you'd like to swing by and take a peek. You are more than welcome to do so. So I'd actually like to start by telling you a short story about how and why I got into ceramics in the first place. This experience had a huge impact on me at the time, and it's really continued to play kind of this perpetual role in my studio outlook today. So, So in college, I majored in history, and at the time I had taken 2 ceramics courses. I was a senior, and I was looking for a summer job, and I came upon a pretty unique opportunity at a historical reenactment village called Hale Farm. And there was no job description, just a job title, which read historical interpreter / potter, whatever the heck that means. And I figured I'm a history major, I have a couple ceramics classes under my belt, so why not? So I applied out on a whim, and to my astonishment, I got a call the next morning saying, our last person quit, you're hired, how soon can you get in here? So I headed in, I think, a day or two later, and I vividly remember walking into the basement of that chapel there, and they immediately began fitting me for my historically accurate garb. I'm kind of standing there like this, and that's when my boss walked in, and she started going over what it was that I was actually going to be doing there, which was to make a series of historically accurate wares for the gift shop, dig and process my own clay from a nearby riverbed, fire a salt kiln, and explain to hundreds of visitors each day what it was that I was doing and what life was like for a potter in early 19th century rural America. So, as you can imagine, this was a lot to take in at first. It's very overwhelmed, but I really enjoyed it, and most importantly, how I was learning. I had never studied a culture or civilization through the pots they made, and that just felt like really fresh and exciting, and I just knew that I wanted history and ceramics in my life in some way. I just had no idea how to make that happen. So this is an image of kind of my pottery zone. People would come up and I'd give my spiel, and I'll never forget day one, like buses pulling in and just walking straight at me, and it was very intimidating. But this brick structure here it actually houses, it's a replica of an old beehive kiln, and it houses a smaller salt kiln inside, and then I dig the clay in the back there. So as I mentioned, I wanted to kind of make this my life, history and ceramics, and I graduated. I kind of floundered for about a year or two, and then I called my my ceramics professor and mentor and kind of asked for some advice, and he said, why don't you come back and spend a semester and work your tail off and submit portfolios to post-baccalaureate programs. So that's what I did. And I applied all over the country and got into the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, which is also where I ended up going to graduate school. So upon moving there, I was really kind of blown away by the landscape and how expansive everything was. I spent a lot of time in the Southwest, so I traveled to and from Lincoln quite a bit, and I was really drawn to this deep, rich color of red that I was seeing against these gray backdrops, and the red with the blue backdrop sky, something that you just don't see too often on the East Coast. The blushing and natural striations, natural divisions, erosion, and kind of material, and how this erosion kind of talked about time and materiality. How lines move over things, and how an edge can create light and shadow. And how lines can accentuate the topography of the land underneath. So it was on one of these trips that I went to one of my all-time favorite museums, the Mesa Verde Museum, which houses many Anasazi artifacts and pots, and I was just immediately drawn to them, specifically just kind of like the simplicity of them, but also how they were kind of like informed by process a lot of the times, leaving these pinch marks and, they show the blushing from the type of firing, a pit firing. And they're just kind of like really straightforward and have this incredible balance to them. This is cut off, I think, but this was on display, and this display depicted the gourd, which was an extremely important food to the Anasazi. It kept through winter and essentially kept them alive, and so it shows how the Anasazi referenced the gourd through different pots in different ways, and there was something about that, how straightforward that was, and it just brought so much more meaning to those pots for me, and that's something that kind of keeps me going in the studio, is a search for more deeper meaning and personal connection. And I just moved back to Ohio where I grew up, and I think there's something about digging the clay in Ohio that I dug as a kid, and it's kind of moving in that direction. But again, that's something that's like a driving force in the studio. So this is some of the work I made during graduate school. I was thinking a lot about the gourd shape myself, thinking about how volumes come together, and really drawn to that kind of curvilinear, uninterrupted line that forms the silhouettes of forms like this. I also began soda firing during this time, and thinking about how flame can move from piece to piece. I also began thinking a lot about volume and having a sense of buoyancy or inflation, and how to use the process of soda firing itself to enhance the form. So I made a lot of pictures during graduate school, and I was kind of getting some interesting surfaces, and I was thinking about form, but a lot of the times it felt like wallpaper over a form that should not have that type of wallpaper. So A big part of my research was positioning pots in very particular parts of the kiln. This piece actually has like a bowl that's made for that pitcher that sits in it to create lines that kind of go better with the form, enhance it, accentuate the volume, and so on. I also began responding to the firing process itself. So I made these wall plate installations, and the plates are just packed in there, 5 per shelf. They're all the same size, and then I fire the kiln and reorient them just as they were in the kiln. So I enjoyed the way that they kind of like revealed themselves as they came out of the kiln, but they also served as maps for me to understand exactly what was happening in that firing. This is an amazing image from my thesis show. Get a good photographer, I'm just gonna say that. But this shows like the front, middle, and back stack of one of the kilns. And again, it served as a map. And I think I've made 6 or 7 of these since then. And every time I try to fire the kiln a different way or use a different clay, so I'm really trying to just expand that research and figure out exactly what's happening in the kiln and where. So after school, I went to Harvard, where I did a teaching residency, and this is a picture of the front of their studio, and I just wanted to show you this to point out the right third of that building, which is a glass-walled gallery that I'm going to bring up in a second. Upon moving there, I really wanted to change it up from soda firing. I began testing many, many glazes. That's all I did while I was there was test glazes. And what I wanted was a glaze that would show the path of the flame in the kiln like the path was shown on raw clay or a slipped surface in reduction and soda. I know that's kind of technical for ceramic people, but on the left there's a reduction pot, and then the same glaze soda fired on the right. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that's kind of where my research is right now. I'm kind of moving back toward glazes and trying to find glazes with similar effects, but this is an example of a glaze that's been slow cooled, and it's creating the depth and surface that I'm kind of looking for. I had a great opportunity to work in a dual live exhibition called Hand Code Makers in Proximity, and it was in that front glass-walled gallery, and it was kind of like a fishbowl in there. You know, people from outside could look inside. They could actually come in to the space. You could see the orange line there, and there were no set rules. Kathy King, the director there, was really awesome. She just let me use it as a workspace, and then my colleague, Jeff Boris, on the other side was using a clay extruding 3D printer. So it didn't take long for us to throw up a couple folding tables in between us and start collaborating. And I think I've done collaborations in the past. A very common one in ceramics is, here's my pot, put your surface on it, vice versa, and it kind of stops there. And while I feel like that can be really successful, this experience was kind of transformative for me in my practice. It was more of a discussion. Pieces were passed back and forth 4 to 5 times. We were in there the whole time conversing. So I think it led to some stronger work. So I think we made about 100 pieces during that time. And one of the great things for me about it was that none of the pieces were functional, so it really helped me think differently. And so one of the themes was kind of bringing different types of pieces together. We were thinking a lot about the quality of the line of the clay extruding 3D printer and how that related to like a throne line or trimming line or any kind of like human line. So we did like a white series, a black series, and then we finished with a soda firing, and that did a pretty good job of kind of marrying these techniques together. So this was a very high temperature soda oxidation. So on the move again, I went out to Helena, Montana, and did a long-term residency at the Archie Bray Foundation. And when I moved out there, I just feel like I began seeing things differently. I had new perspective. Like you see the mountains in the background there. They're very flat. They're a lot about silhouette and horizon line, and then you move closer and you get a different feeling from them, and then you are hiking in the gulches, hiking on trails, and you're experiencing those mountains in a different way. So to go further with that, I thought this would be a great example. I don't know if you recognize this. This is a great rock. So, you see, I think about rocks like this and objects in general quite frequently. So, from afar, you see this rock and its scale and its perspective and its relationship with the trees, and it's grounded and it's kind of monotone. It's like, is that one color? It's like a grayish brown with maybe some color. But upon further examination, you find that this one solid rock is actually made up of much smaller rocks, and there's color, and it's tactile, and it's rough, and you can walk around it and get different perspective. And then it isn't until like a intentional close examination that you begin to unveil like the intricacies and kind of like a different level of beauty. This is so different from that far back picture, and that's what I try to do with vessels. Think of a vase on a tabletop, how you see it. It's about silhouette, and you move closer, you see it a different way. And especially for pots, there's this kind of added level, like a cup. You're holding it regularly. You're putting it to your mouth. You're washing it. You're literally touching every surface of it. And so, a big part of what I'm trying to do is like create subtlety in the work that kind of comes out with time. And some of my favorite pots that I own have truly done that, and they've kind of unveiled themselves like years later. I discover some kind of detail or intricacy of what they were trying to say. So this is some of the work I made while I was out in Montana. I went out of the round. I began changing the form, altering them, much like we're doing in our workshop, leaving thick bottoms on pieces, paddling them, throwing without a bottom. Again, thinking about edge and how to direct the path of the flame through the kiln with a pot. I've always dug my own clay. It was a lot different out in Montana. It's a lot different here. Instead of like digging plastic clay that's readily available, you have to go out with a pickaxe and chisel rock off a rock face. So in this case, I was sourcing pink granite and bringing it back and hammer milling it, and then ultimately adding it to the clay, something that I started out there. And that's what those pink dots are that you see. And then just thinking of something really simple like how a flame is affected by an edge versus a round surface can speak totally different on something as simple as a cup. Throughout my entire ceramic career, I've been looking at historical everything for reference, and this is just some of what I've been looking at more recently. This is Tony Smith, Brancusi, who I think I'm really drawn to his use of material, light and shadow, symmetry, repetition, and like his trueness to the material. This is Isamu Noguchi. I was fortunate enough to go to the Noguchi Museum in New York recently, and I was just floored by what I saw there. I don't know if anyone else has been there, but pretty incredible. And he's like just really true to the material. You want to walk around the pieces, and he also exercises this really great element of restraint, which is something I'm constantly thinking about in my own work. This was very recent, so I'm very excited to get back in the studio and start exploring some new, maybe non-functional forms. Also look a lot at all kinds of work from the Bauhaus era, specifically these silver and ebony tea sets that I think exhibit a great amount of like asymmetry, form following function. They're kind of like challenging that, especially at that time. So I've referenced some of those pots pretty directly. This surface, again, kind of a technical ceramic thing, but is an exploration of a process called reduction cooling, in which you reach the temperature, your max temperature of the kiln, and then you actually fire it backwards very slowly by adding charcoal and wood or other organic material to create kind of these sootier, more carbon-filled surfaces. Just a vase I've been thinking a lot about lately. I've been studying with an Ikebana artist for a couple of years, and it's fascinating what is a good vase in the Ikebana world versus my previous world. Like a low, wide cylinder is like a really nice vase form. But I just started thinking a lot more about flower arranging and what the vessel is doing when it's not in use versus when it has flowers in it. So create these really small openings. Sometimes like a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch can actually fit like 12 flowers in it. And it constricts the stems. So what I'm interested in is like that moment of like the bright green stems going into that pot. And so you have like pot, stems, and then flowers up top. So one's not really like trumping the other. And I've just been searching for balance. Previous vases I had made, first of all, you need like 50 flowers to fill it, and then they droop over the pot. So I just don't want the flowers to become more important or the pot to become more important. So that's kind of where I'm at with the vases. Oh, and the top. I was originally making them flat or convex, but it was very difficult to get water into them. So I started making these concave surfaces, and you can kind of pour the water anywhere in that opening. But I will say it's very difficult to get the water out of the vase. So if you have any ideas, let me know. This is probably what I'm most excited about in the studio right now. I've been making these for a couple years, but the week before coming here, I actually made a few. And they're much more sculptural than how I typically work. They're about 4 feet tall. And the very last thing I did was cast one in concrete. So using a totally different material, very uncomfortable, but excited to think about form in a different way. This is a sapphire box, and it's fired, so the flash happens on that opening, and I just kind of like the action of, the viewer typically will line it up, but it's also very intriguing when it's left kind of in a new composition. So it's something I'm interested in and trying to bring that into new forms. And that's just a teapot. Not much more to say about that. This is a slip cast piece. So it was first made out of clay, and then I made a plaster mold and used some stoneware casting slip for it. It's a form that I couldn't make any other way. I couldn't make it by hand. I couldn't throw it and alter it. But it was really great to have Joanne and Sam in the studio this week challenging me and brainstorming with different ways to make it. So we actually made a much larger one, solid, cut it in half, carved it out, put it back together. So thanks. And then some of the forms I slip cast are first 3D printed. So this started as plastic, and then I sand the edges off to remove the robotic arm line. But I'm also very interested in leaving certain lines, as you see here. And that's kind of been the battle, is like how much do I leave? How much of that information do I actually want on the vessel? Yeah. And I also use wooden molds or bisque molds to make these folded trays. So I make a whole series of these. And I always get the question, like, what do you use that for? and I honestly don't really know. It's kind of more of a sculptural vessel, and that's something I'm always thinking about, is like, what's more important to me, like the function or the sculptural value of it. And for me, I think it's a little more on the sculptural side, but it still needs to work. So that's kind of where I am with that. Finally, as you've probably picked up, I've moved around a lot over the past many years, and finally my wife and I bought a property in Southeast Ohio. And one unique thing about the property is that it's on an old coal mine. It closed down about 100 years ago. It was actually the deepest shaft mine in Ohio. It's 500 feet straight down. It's been since filled with school buses. But there's all these like old ruins and decay and things happening on the property. This is the old office building, which we didn't anticipate, but it was actually in pretty good condition once we ripped everything out. So the idea is to turn the bottom floor into a gallery and the top floor into like a maker's workspace. So that's kind of like the big project. It's not really making, but I'm learning a lot and trying to build community out there in Southeast Ohio. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. We're going to commence with a Q&A, and I'm going to put some chairs up front here.
And I'll fix the lights too. Just give me one. Thank you.
Okay, does anyone have a question?
Hello. So this question is about the paper weaving. I know you mentioned that like the actual material was like kind of strong, but was there anything else that you did to keep it from like not falling apart when you were weaving stuff?
Yeah, you twist it with a spindle, and so it just winds up really tight, which is how wool is spun, same way. And so by that point, that's when the thread becomes really strong. It's fairly delicate up until that point because the paper gets wet. And then you can steam it or boil it, and that sets the twist.
Very cool. Thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, what? Okay.
This one is about the digging of the clay at the beginning. So was there a reason why they had you like dig the clay yourself? Was that for like a presentation to the audience, or like why didn't you just buy clay?
I think because it was cheaper. And that's just how it was done there. They wanted to really stick to how it was, early 19th century. So that took a lot of research and a lot of failure, for sure. But we did do a clay dig last week, and we're going to be processing it this week. If you want to stop by the ceramics room to just kind of observe that process, you're more than welcome.
That's a great question. I was wondering the same thing. I have a question. It's about legibility and illegibility, and I guess it could be for both of you, but I'm interested in the idea, Kenturah, because you first talked about information and different types of information and exposing some and not exposing some. So can you talk a little bit about what it means for you to make something legible through illegibility?
That's a good question. Let's see, I think there's a couple ways I think about it. One is like, I think about this fact that we can never see something in its entirety. Like there's a front side or a back side or something inside or outside. And so thinking about like the limits of knowledge and being comfortable with that, or what's at the edge of our perception, I'm really into that space, because I think, especially with portraiture, and this got heightened during grad school, where I realized like with portraiture, it's so easy to like see an image or representational image and think you know it. And I've been trying to slow down that the way one might draw conclusions about what you see. And so I think drifting in and out of legibility has been really important. So, initially the first text drawings I was making, there would always be some area where the text is pretty legible. But then I got into thinking about it was this accumulation over time. And so at a certain point, that accumulation of information, it's still there, but you can't tease it out. So, I think that kind of relates to us in our day-to-day experience. I see you are, so in a way, your own kind of vessel and container of information, but I can't tease out all the specific parts. And I feel that way about myself too. So I think there's some real value in thinking about everything is not accessible, and sort of drifting through the space of what's accessible to you, but also making it very clear that some things you don't have access to.
And Stuart, you were talking about, making decisions about what to show and what not to show the information through either the process of making and what to sort of change and leave. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means for you?
Yeah, definitely. So for the 3D printing, I feel like it's kind of new on the scene to ceramics in particular, especially with the clay extruding 3D printer. And I really enjoy work that really talks about that process, and I think there's been some really strong work that's done that. But for me, every piece that popped out of the 3D printer just kind of spoke about that process too much. It was a little too overt. So I began erasing. At first I would erase all of that information, but there was something about the line quality of the robotic arm that I think the human hand is incapable of, and is also very interesting in showing detail. So subtly unveiling that kind of information is interesting to me. And I talked a little bit about it in our workshop, but throwing lines on the side of a pot are very common in ceramics, and I really enjoy a nice, in ceramics we call them loose pots, kind of folky pots that are very true to the process, true to the wheel itself, the treadle wheel or the kick wheel. But for me, it just felt ingenuine when I would leave the throwing mark. So all week we've been spending a lot of time with different types of tools erasing the mark of the hand.
You'd also shown those landscape pictures with all the lines and the geological formations, which I thought was interesting too, that history.
Yeah, and I didn't show any images, but for a while my work was highly detailed and decorative, and there were lots of patterns, and using a tool to drag over the form to accentuate the form itself with line, but I've definitely moved away from that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Oh, I'll come back.
This is a question for both of you. I felt really excited about and inspired by the mixing of history and ceramics and text and image, and I am curious if in your processes and at this point in your careers and your processes and stuff that is there text without image, image without text, and you're searching for the intersection, or history without ceramics, ceramics without history, or is it they're so inextricable in the way that you work that it's on the other side of the spectrum, perhaps hard to escape the intersection as opposed to something that you're actively looking for?
Okay. Good question. I think history is pretty inescapable. You always hear everything's been done before, so I just try to do as much research as I can, and that's kind of what I want to do, and why I got into it in the first place is learning about form, what forms were made, but also how those forms functioned in these particular cultures and what that can say about the culture. So it's not really this forefront part of my work in terms of like what I want people to get out of it is kind of like a more personal, like, it's my own personal research that keeps me interested in going in the studio.
I'm not sure I escape the intersection. I'm trying to think if I try to. I guess I'm always thinking about like the work comes from me and I can't escape language. I mean, none of us really can. And language itself is a system that's been, put on us, that we're always processing the world with the help of our facility to use language, write language, communicate. So I think I'm really, so it's such a deep, rich pool that I don't quite yet feel a desire to pivot, but that's not to say it won't happen at some point. But I think lately, well, certainly introducing the threads was interesting because the text is, if you don't know, you don't know. And so I like the idea of like a kind of object that doesn't desire or rely on somebody looking at it knowing what it is. And it's not even, I wouldn't necessarily even call it a secret, but I like to use the word like embodiment. Like here's this material that embodies a kind of idea that's not necessarily perceptible to other people.
Stuart, just wanted to ask you one question, because ceramics has so many steps, right? And you're always just moving from one thing to the other. What's your original kind of thing that you fell in love with ceramics, and then has that changed over time?
Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned it earlier with the connection to the land in Ohio, but like I think a lot of it has to do with my childhood and digging around in clay, and it was like a big part of my upbringing was just being outside and like digging holes until I hit the water, and then building things out of that clay. And I think that came back in college when I took that throwing class, and it was just something so like ingrained in me and so human. And that was the initial grab, and then I found out about like this historic connection, and that's how I wanted to spend the rest of my life.
Okay.
No questions on that side?
This is just a quick question about your portraiture. I was just wondering about your portrait subjects, and if you do portraiture of people that you know or of strangers or both, and how that, where your subjects come from.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, they tend to be friends, myself and friends. But lately I've been on this like, a kind of specific path of thinking about language as a kind of choreography. So that's why like some of the images have this kind of intentional blur to it. So I've actually been like seeking out dancers. So people like just out of interest in people skilled in movement so that it feels very intuitive when I'm making the photographs that then I use to reference the drawings. So, but then they become friends. So then it's like a whole circle.
We have time for one more question.
My question's going to be two in one. And it's, I was curious, so much of your work is about we're looking at the image, but how do you choose your text? And how much time do you spend on the words and the message of that? And since it's only one question, you switched quickly to vessels on some of your images, but you didn't talk about why or where that came from.
Yeah. I just spaced on the first part of your question. Texts. No, really say the whole thing again. Sorry, I'm getting foggy brain up here because of the.
Yeah. Where does the text come from, and
Yes,
how much time
sorry.
do you spend like finding the words?
Got it. So I read and write a lot. So some of the for a lot of the drawings, probably most of them, they're kind of short phrases. And there's a series I started called Blur in the Interest of Precision. So I was really interested in teasing apart like the ways we tend to set up binaries in conversation. Is something this or is it that? And me always feeling like maybe the answer is somewhere in between. So I would come up with these phrases that found some blurry thing in the way we use language. And then more recently, I've been writing these kind of longer essays that fold in ideas from a lot of the things I'm reading. So that last body of work really brings together a bunch of different disciplines from like quantum physics, anthropology, dance, and tries to think about what those things could have in common. It's talking a lot about movement and a lot about perception. The vessels, so the drawings that have the text kind of impressed into the paper, I think a lot about the word vessel and what can be a vessel. And even thinking about like a metaphor for like who we are, I don't know, in some kind of spiritual context, it's like the body is a vessel. And so extending from that, I've been, again, thinking broadly about like what can a vessel be, and there's kind of hierarchies in the art world, like a painting is better than a work on paper, and I push back against that. And so I do see paper as a kind of object, even though it feels flat to you, it is still something that exists in space. And then when you change the surface, it immediately, like creating those cavities where the text gets impressed in, it immediately creates this kind of cavity, this kind of space for a kind of pregnant meaning type of thing. And so I've been calling those drawings planar vessels, and they've been paired with the textiles. But then I was like, oh, maybe my partner got a lathe last year, and so we started experimenting with turning objects, wooden vessels. So I was like, what would it be like to pair something we consider an actual vessel with what I'm calling a planar vessel? And so thinking about like the relationship between the two that both have these kind of cavities and are a kind of container of information.
Can I say one question? You're ready to wrap it up. I think it's important to acknowledge both of your gifts, and your mediums are so diverse and different. And Stuart, you said something that stood out to me about being true to the material. I've worked for decades with stone, natural stones, and I kind of related to how that might be for you. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that goes along the lines of Betsy's question about how much to leave and how much to erase. So removing the throwing lines, removing kind of that layer of the human. And the way I fire, soda firing, it's raw clay, it's clay from the land, and I want to like appreciate that. And you know, the soda and the flame and the carbon kind of accentuates it and pulls out some of that kind of beauty that I'm interested in, that materiality that I'm interested in. So yeah, I think a lot of my work is like distilling things down, seeing how much I can take away to really emphasize the material nature, but also have it be something. You know, Noguchi really walks that line, I think, of like, is this a rock? Is this just like a rock on a pedestal? Oh wait, like he touched it here and it was like the perfect chisel or the perfect like cut. And so just really, you know, going back to just can't wait to get back in the studio.
Thank you, everybody. And remember that both artists are here all week, so if you have another question or you come up with one, you can ask them anytime. Have a great week, and we'll see you, if you are new in the workshops, we'll see you at 8:45 tomorrow right here. Thank you.